next speaker is Simon Roberts, who's Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Energy. So please, a welcome to Simon.
Okay, still saying 10 minutes, right, I've got 10 minutes. I'm going to meander down two different strands of thinking that were stimulated by the question we were set. It's unashamedly energy focused. I'm from the Centre for Sustainable Energy. We're a charity that works on sustainable energy, so that's kind of what you're going to get. One strand is theoretical, the public interest versus consumer interest and where that sits in policy and regulatory circles and what I think the challenges that creates. And the other one's much more instrumental, how we might actually make it work well in what I think is a very imperfect system, but is also always likely to be an imperfect system, and therefore we might need to have a slightly more messy solution than would be ideal. The first point I'd make is that, Sharon's kind of drawn out this distinction between the public interest and the consumer interest, but I think there's a rather lazy assumption in a lot of political and regulatory discourse that the public interest and the consumer interest are sort of the same, particularly if you add in the interests of future consumers into the duties on regulators. So for Ofgem to have a duty that is to protect the interests of current and future consumers, somehow that means that it encapsulates all of the things we might need a regulator to be thinking about when they're coming to their view about how to regulate energy markets, energy systems, monopoly network companies in that. I think that's wrong as a starting point, but also I think it's led to a position where I think the political class and policymakers have largely detached themselves from the business of shaping the regulatory and strategic frameworks. They've kind of left it to the regulators, and I think that leaves a very big gap in terms of how the public interest is being played out in the design of energy markets and the regulation and direction of travel and strategic purpose of network companies in the future. Now, actually, I think there is a kind of space where that isn't a problem if the regulators and the advocates who tend to be statutorily representing consumer interests have what I call a sophisticated conception of consumer interests. That's one which goes beyond price, value for money, choice, opportunity for redress, reliability of transactions, safety, some of the things that Sharon was putting up. And generally speaking, they don't. Or put it more specifically, it's latent. We ran a program for Ofgem in 2009 where we ran a series of workshops across the entire organisation at lots of different levels, right up to board level, to explore what sustainable development meant to Ofgem as they were kind of going down that particular journey. But we did it in the context of the interests of existing and future consumers. And we just started off with a classic kind of, here are lots of bits of post-it notes. Write a consumer interest that you think your duty is to protect. Use yellow post-its for existing consumers and green post-its for future consumers. Some of them you might want to write on both colours. And what came out of this exercise at every level of Ofgem, from the kind of junior intern, first intake fast trackers, up to the board, was what I would describe as a sophisticated conception of consumer interests. It included, for example, issues around fair distribution of costs and benefits between generations and also within generations, so that people who were paying for the network to be in place weren't the cost of that wasn't being unfairly distributed amongst different consumer groups. That there was timely investment and innovation to make sure the system was being fit for the needs it was needing to meet, and also that there was strong innovation. What was also interesting in that process is I went off and talked to some of the statutory consumer groups and asked them how they developed their own conception of consumer interests, and they had no method. And I think that's still a question for consumer advocates. How do you develop and legitimise your conception of consumer interests that you claim to be representing in these policy-making processes? I think it's an important question to be able to answer. Even if I don't like the answer you come up with, at least you need to be thinking about where it's come from. So, what that comes to, basically, when you look at what that sophisticated conception looks like, it looks very much like what one would describe as the public interest in terms of what we're trying to get out of and what a sustainable energy future looks like to me, what we're trying to get out of the energy system. So if you can develop that, and that sophisticated conception is run through the DNA of the regulators, then the fact that the public interest bit isn't being looked after by policymakers maybe doesn't matter. I think it probably does. But if it isn't in the regulatory space, and it doesn't run through the DNA of the regulators, then we've got a problem. And we need to reopen the process with policy making to get them to start to articulate the strategic direction of the energy system and energy markets at a level which enables the regulator to do the economic regulation they seem to be trying to retreat into. So what does a smarter electricity system actually look like? How are we going to, what is the future of the gas network? That's not a decision for a regulator to come to on the basis of business plans being put forward by gas distribution companies, for example. It's something that needs that wider policy space, and I'm not sure we're getting that at the moment. So in the absence of a sophisticated conception of consumer interests, we probably need to reopen the policy thing. So that's the theoretical strand. Now in the remaining 4 minutes and 8 seconds, I'm going to look at the more instrumental approach of being involved in the consumer challenge group for Ofgem, for the price controls since DPCR5, with some what I call sophisticated consumer advocates, one of which was the late and very great Jill Owen, but also Sharon, Trish McCauley, and a number of other people, Linda Leonard, a number of who will know, who have basically formed this kind of ginger group, critical friend group within Ofgem, not to challenge the companies, and interestingly that some other regulators seem to think it's the companies that need challenging by consumers, but to challenge Ofgem with what is in effect a sophisticated conception of consumer interest to improve their decision making, because that thinking is absent within the regulator on a routine basis. So if it's not there, it needs to be brought in and put that challenge to them. As a result of that, and I've been through 4 different price controls in that process, I think we got much better outcomes in relation to how to stimulate innovation in network companies, much better outcomes in terms of vulnerable consumers and the role of network companies in that, more work on low carbon system transition and the role of transmission operators in that, more on asset health, on stakeholder engagement, on improved communications from the regulator about how the consumer interest was driving their decision rather than competition or some other thing. And we also help buttress the regulator against the companies, because otherwise it's the kind of regulator versus company thing. And very importantly, I think, and probably quite late in the day, actually help the regulator, I'm not sure it's stuck, but start to think about organisational psychology. Not what do our regulatory instruments do, but how do you achieve change, cultural change and organisational change in a company? And recognise that the regulatory tools have different effects, and you need to think about what those effects need to be in the different companies. And that's something which I still think, and in the final kind of wash-up of the Consumer Challenge Group, we recommended to Ofgem that they thought about that issue far more in their future work. How do your regulatory tools change the company behaviour? Because that's ultimately what you're trying to do, be that a monopoly or a company in a so-called competitive market. You see a little about behavioural insights and consumers, need a bit more around behavioural insights and company behaviour, because there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of heuristics, a lot of those biases operate within companies as much as they do within, they're not rational actors either. So we did recommend also that they extended the Consumer Challenge Group function, that kind of sophisticated consumer advocate piece, working within Ofgem to challenge it on its own terms, beyond just the price controls of monopolies, but also into markets. That hasn't been done yet, but that concerns me as we shift towards more principle-based regulation. How are Ofgem developing their perspective on what the fair treatment of customers is? Where's that coming from, that notion of fairness? Because that's going to be one of the driving conceptions that they need to be putting in place. And they need to think about that not only for existing consumers, but also future consumers. And in a competitive market in particular, that becomes very interesting in terms of the role of trust and so forth. There's also no sign that the political class is about to leap back into that, defining the public interest and setting the remit more for regulators, though there's starting to be signs that that might be changing. But I think we're most likely to, in a slightly messy world where it's not going to be ideal, I think one of the ways in which we can deal with the fact that public interest isn't playing out is through the sort of consumer challenge group within the regulator as a sort of ginger group, a resourced challenge group that brings that sophisticated perception of consumer interests into regulatory decision making right across the piece. It shouldn't really be needed. In theory, that's what the Board of Ofgem's for. But it is, because those ideas aren't dominating the decision-making process. And in the public interest, we need to make sure it's put back in there. Thank you very much.